Master Chief Jake "Deadeye" Morrison had 127 confirmed kills as a Navy SEAL sniper. When a mysterious civilian woman outshot him with a Barrett .50 he recognized from Iraq, his blood ran cold. That serial number belonged to a weapon lost 3 years ago, and its wielder was supposed to be dead. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake "Deadeye" Morrison crouched behind the concrete barrier at the Quantico Marine Corps shooting range, his M4 carbine feeling strangely inadequate in his weathered hands. The Virginia morning was crisp, with autumn fog rolling across the 1,000-yard rifle range where some of the military's best marksmen came to prove their skills. Around him, 20 other Special Operations veterans lined up for the annual Inter-Service Precision Shooting Competition. At 43, Jake had spent 22 years as a Navy SEAL sniper. His service record included 4 combat deployments, 127 confirmed kills, and a reputation for making impossible shots under the most challenging conditions. The call sign Deadeye had been earned during a night operation in Afghanistan when he'd taken out 3 enemy fighters at ranges exceeding 800 meters using iron sights and instinct. But today felt different. Today Jake was competing against civilians. The Precision Rifle Challenge had been expanded to include non-military participants for the first time in its 15-year history. Corporate sponsors wanted broader appeal, and competition organizers needed to fill slots after budget cuts reduced military participation. Jake viewed the civilian shooters with professional skepticism, weekend warriors playing at being operators, armed with expensive equipment and lacking the real-world experience that separated killers from hobbyists. Lane assignments are posted, announced Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the range safety officer. We'll begin with the 500-yard prone position, then move to 750 standing, and finish with the 1,000-yard precision challenge. Jake found his assigned position and began setting up his equipment. The Remington 700 was a familiar weapon system, chambered in .308 Winchester with a Leupold Mark IV scope. Standard military issue, reliable and accurate in the hands of someone who understood ballistics and wind compensation. Nothing fancy, nothing that would give him an unfair advantage over civilian competitors. 2 lanes over, a young woman was assembling what looked like a custom precision rifle. Jake estimated she was maybe 25 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with mechanical precision. Her weapon appeared to be a Remington 700 Action in a custom stock, topped with high-end optics that probably cost more than Jake made in a month. First time at a military competition? Jake called over, making conversation while he adjusted his scope settings. The woman looked up with green eyes that seemed to evaluate him with uncomfortable intensity. "Something like that," she replied, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "What do you do for work?" Jake continued, assuming she was probably a nurse or teacher who shot as a hobby. Most civilian women in precision rifle sports came from professional backgrounds that had nothing to do with tactical shooting. "Consulting," she said simply, returning her attention to her rifle setup. Jake nodded, translating consulting as code for unemployed with rich parents who funded expensive hobbies. The custom rifle certainly supported that theory. Her equipment looked like it belonged in a gun magazine rather than a combat zone. The first stage began with shooters engaging targets at 500 yards from the prone position. Jake settled into his familiar firing stance, feeling muscle memory take over as he controlled his breathing and aligned his sights. The fundamentals of marksmanship were automatic after 2 decades of practice. Natural point of aim, consistent cheek weld, smooth trigger press. His first shot was a perfect center hit. The second and third followed with mechanical precision, each round impacting within inches of the bullseye. Jake completed his string of fire with casual confidence, knowing he'd posted a score that would be difficult for amateur shooters to match. "Clean run, Morrison," commented Colonel Peters, one of the military observers. "That's why they call you Deadeye." Jake accepted the compliment with professional satisfaction, then glanced toward the civilian woman's lane to see how she was performing. What he saw made him pause with confusion. Her target showed 5 perfect hits clustered in a group smaller than his own. Not just good shooting but precision that indicated serious training and natural ability. Jake looked more closely at her firing position and technique, noting details he'd missed during his initial assessment. Her prone position was textbook perfect, elbows positioned for maximum stability, body alignment optimized for recoil management, cheek weld consistent and repeatable. More importantly, her target engagement rhythm showed the kind of timing that came from thousands of rounds of practice under pressure. "Not bad for a first-timer," Jake called over, though his tone carried less condescension than before. "Thanks," she replied without looking up from her data book, where she was recording atmospheric conditions and making calculations for the next firing position. The 750-yard standing stage was where most civilian shooters began to struggle. Shooting from the standing position required core strength, balance, and the ability to control muscular tension while maintaining sight alignment. Jake had seen plenty of weekend warriors who could shoot well from a bench rest but fell apart when forced to engage targets without artificial support. Jake approached the firing line with complete confidence. Standing shots at 750 yards were challenging but well within his capabilities. He'd made similar shots during combat operations, often under conditions far more demanding than a controlled range environment. His first shot was slightly left of center, but within acceptable parameters. He adjusted his hold and fired again, this time achieving a direct center hit. The remaining shots followed with the consistency that had made him one of the most feared snipers in special operations. But when he looked toward the civilian woman's target, Jake felt the first stirring of genuine concern. Her group was tighter than his own, with all 5 shots clustered in an area the size of a silver dollar. That level of precision from the standing position indicated training that went far beyond weekend hobby shooting. "Who is she?" Jake asked Colonel Peters quietly. Checked her registration form. "Sarah McKinnon from North Carolina." Lists her occupation as defense contractor. Defense contractor could mean anything from supply logistics to advanced weapons development. But Jake was beginning to suspect that Sarah McKinnon's background might be more interesting than her deliberately vague answers suggested. The final stage was the 1,000-yard precision challenge, where shooters would engage human silhouette targets at maximum effective range for their weapon systems. This was where real expertise separated from recreational shooting, where atmospheric conditions, ballistic calculations, and pure marksmanship skill combined to create one of the most challenging shots in competitive shooting. Jake had made similar shots in combat, though never under the controlled conditions of a competition range. The variables were complex: wind speed and direction, air density, temperature gradients, even the rotation of the Earth became factors at extreme range. Success required not just shooting ability but understanding of physics, mathematics, and environmental conditions. As he prepared for the final stage, Jake noticed Sarah McKinnon assembling a different rifle. This wasn't the custom Remington 700 she'd been using for the earlier stages. This was something else entirely, a weapon system that made Jake's blood run cold with recognition. Barrett Model 82A1. 50 caliber. Semi-automatic anti-material rifle capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The kind of weapon typically used by military snipers for engaging vehicles, equipment, and personnel at extreme distances. But it wasn't just any Barrett .50 caliber rifle. Jake could see modifications and accessories that indicated this wasn't a civilian legal version purchased through normal commercial channels. The barrel was shorter than standard, suggesting a military configuration optimized for mobility rather than maximum accuracy. The scope was a Schmidt and Bender variable power optic that cost more than most people's cars. Most disturbing was the serial number visible on the receiver. Jake had an excellent memory for details, and he was almost certain he'd seen that specific serial number before, in a very different context. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been present during their earlier conversation. "That's an interesting rifle you've got there." She looked up from her preparations, and Jake could see her evaluating his tone, his posture, his sudden shift from casual conversation to professional wariness. "It's a Barrett .50, she replied simply. "I can see that. What I'm wondering is where you acquired a weapon with those particular specifications." Sarah's hands paused in their methodical preparation, and Jake could see her making the same kind of tactical assessment he'd made thousands of times during his military career. How much did he know? How much should she reveal? What were the potential consequences of different responses? "It was legally purchased through an FFL dealer," she said finally. "That's not what I asked." The range around them had gone quiet as other shooters sensed the sudden tension between the veteran SEAL and the mysterious civilian woman. Colonel Peters was watching the interaction with professional interest, recognizing that something significant was developing. Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to the kind of tone he'd used during tactical interrogations in hostile territory. "That barrel configuration isn't available on civilian models. The optic mounting system is military specification. And unless I'm mistaken, that serial number belongs to a weapon that was reported lost during operations in Iraq 3 years ago." Sarah's green eyes locked onto his with an intensity that Jake recognized from his own mirror. This wasn't the gaze of a civilian hobbyist who'd stumbled into a military competition. This was the measured stare of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. "Where did you serve?" she asked quietly. 22 years, Navy SEALs. Multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. DevGru for the last 8 years before retirement. She nodded slowly, processing this information with the kind of systematic analysis that came from intelligence training. Team 6. That's right. And I'm thinking you might have some familiarity with similar organizations. Sarah McKinnon, if that was even her real name, looked around the shooting range at the assembled military personnel and civilian competitors. Jake could see her calculating risks, considering options, making the kind of operational decision that defined careers in the world of special operations. "I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," she said finally. Colonel Peters approached as the tension reached a level that was affecting other competitors. "Is there a problem here?" "Sir," Jake replied, "I believe this weapon may have irregular provenance. I'd like to examine the documentation and verify its legal status." "Ms. McKinnon," Peters said formally, "would you mind providing your ATF Form 4473 and any other relevant paperwork?" Sarah reached into her equipment bag and produced a folder containing what appeared to be legitimate federal firearms documentation. But Jake wasn't interested in paperwork, he was studying her reactions, her body language, her eyes. "The documents appear to be in order," Peters announced after reviewing the forms. But Jake knew documents could be forged, identities could be manufactured, and people with certain skill sets could make themselves appear to be anyone they needed to be. What couldn't be faked was the way Sarah handled the Barrett .50 with absolute familiarity, the way she'd automatically assumed firing positions that indicated advanced training, the way she'd evaluated him as a potential threat rather than a fellow competitor. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "I need to know where you got that rifle." She looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her making a decision that would determine whether this conversation ended with handshakes or handcuffs. Camp Fallujah, Iraq. March 2019. My spotter took a sniper's bullet through the head during Overwatch on Route Michigan. I used this rifle to eliminate 7 enemy combatants from an average range of 1,400 meters before conducting emergency extraction under fire. The words hit Jake like physical blows. March 2019, Camp Fallujah, Route Michigan. He'd been there. He'd been part of the quick reaction force that responded to reports of American casualties during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. "Call sign?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Phantom." Jake felt the world shift around him. Phantom. The CIA sniper who'd saved an entire Marine patrol during one of the bloodiest ambushes of the Iraq drawdown. The operator whose identity was so classified that even SEAL Team 6 personnel had never been given her real name. "You're supposed to be dead," Jake said quietly. "Officially I am dead. Sarah McKinnon is a carefully constructed identity designed to let me live a normal life after 20 years of doing things the government can't acknowledge." Jake looked around the shooting range with new understanding. The other competitors, the military observers, the range safety officers, none of them knew they were watching a ghost participate in their competition. "The Barrett? Acquired during my final operation. When the CIA disavowed my existence, I kept certain equipment as insurance. That rifle has been used to eliminate 63 high-value targets across 4 continents. It's probably the most effective sniper weapon in existence." Colonel Peters was watching their conversation with growing concern. "Morrison, is there a problem with this competitor?" Jake looked at Sarah, or Phantom, or whatever her real name might be, and made his own operational decision. She could have killed him a dozen times during their conversation if she'd wanted to. The fact that she was here, competing in a precision shooting competition using her real skills, suggested she was looking for something other than violence. "No sir," Jake replied. "Just discussing equipment specifications." The 1,000-yard precision stage proceeded with Sarah using the Barrett .50 to achieve scores that redefined what was possible in competitive shooting. Her first shot was a perfect center hit. The second, third, fourth, and fifth followed with mechanical precision, each round impacting within a circle smaller than Jake's fist. Jake completed his own string of fire with the knowledge that he'd been outshot by someone whose skills exceeded anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of military service. The civilian woman who'd seemed like a hobby shooter was actually one of the most lethal individuals he'd ever met. As the competition concluded and scores were tallied, Jake approached Sarah during equipment cleanup. "Why are you here?" "Same reason as you," she replied while disassembling the Barrett with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "Trying to figure out what comes after the war." "And?" "Still working on that part." Jake understood. The transition from operator to civilian was challenging for everyone who'd spent their careers in special operations. But Sarah's situation was uniquely complicated, officially dead, unofficially alive, possessing skills that had no civilian application and carrying memories that could never be shared. There are programs, Jake said carefully. Support networks for people with our kind of background. Not for people like me. I don't exist in any official capacity. No service records, no veterans benefits, no recognition for 20 years of classified operations. The loneliness in her voice was something Jake recognized from his own post-military struggles. But his challenges were manageable compared to being erased from official existence while carrying the psychological weight of classified kills across multiple continents. Sarah, or whatever you want me to call you, you don't have to disappear completely. There are people who understand what you've been through. She finished packing the Barrett into a custom case that probably concealed its true contents from casual observation. Jake, I appreciate the concern. But getting too close to people is dangerous for everyone involved. My enemies are still out there and they have long memories. As she prepared to leave, Jake realized he might never see her again. Ghost operators had a way of vanishing as completely as their official records, leaving behind only whispered stories and unconfirmed legends. Phantom, he said, using her operational call sign for the first time. If you ever need backup, you can reach me through SEAL Team 6 alumni networks. Real operators take care of each other, regardless of which organization we served. Sarah McKinnon, Phantom, looked back at him with something that might have been gratitude. Thanks, Deadeye. Maybe I'll take you up on that someday. As her vehicle disappeared into Virginia traffic, Jake stood alone on the shooting range, processing what he'd just experienced. The civilian woman who'd outshot some of the military's best marksmen was actually a dead CIA operative whose kill count probably exceeded his own by a significant margin. The Barrett .50 that had triggered his recognition was a weapon with a history written in classified blood across multiple theaters of operation. And the person wielding it was trying to build a normal life from the fragments of an identity that had been officially erased. Jake understood why Sarah had frozen when he'd asked about the rifle's provenance. It wasn't just a weapon to her, it was the last remaining proof of a career that couldn't be acknowledged, a life that couldn't be celebrated, and sacrifices that would never be recognized. As he packed his own equipment, Jake reflected on the strange afternoon when he'd met someone whose skills exceeded his own, whose service had been more classified than his, and whose transition to civilian life was infinitely more complicated than anything he'd faced. The Deadeye mark he'd carried with pride for 2 decades suddenly seemed less significant when compared to someone who'd spent 20 years existing in the shadows, eliminating threats to national security that the public would never know about. That evening, Jake sat in his apartment, staring at competition results that showed Sarah McKinnon had achieved the highest precision shooting scores in the event's 15-year history. But he knew the real story wasn't about marksmanship scores, it was about a ghost learning to live in the light, carrying weapons and memories that connected her to a past she could never fully escape. 6 months later, Jake received an encrypted message through channels he hadn't used since active duty. The message was brief: "Thanks for keeping quiet about old equipment. Phantom is settling into civilian life. Deadeye made that possible." Jake smiled, understanding that Sarah McKinnon, whoever she really was, had found her path forward. Sometimes the best thing one operator could do for another was simply recognize their service and keep their secrets. The Barrett .50 might have triggered his recognition, but the woman behind it had earned his respect. In the world of special operations, that was the highest form of acknowledgement possible. And somewhere in North Carolina, a dead CIA sniper was learning to live again, one precision shot at a time.